Okay, it's 11:45 here in Chicago. Welcome back to Emerging Scholars in Premodern Critical Race Studies. We're excited about this panel, which deals with a bit of visual culture. Each of our four presenters will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we will have time for Q&A. And you can put questions in the Q&A box or in the chat at any time, or panelists are free also to raise their hands and join in the conversation. So we will not do it. We'll be putting the bios in the chat momentarily, and we'll just go ahead and get started with our first speaker, Amber Burbidge, who's coming in from the European University. Can't believe I just butchered that. European, please help, Amber.
European University Institute.
Institute, thank you. Oh, incredible place. You should all go visit. So it's good to see you, Amber, and take it away.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. Sorry, 1 second. Can you all see that? Perfect. Okay, so thank you so much to the organizers. I'm really excited to have this opportunity, and it's been really amazing to meet all these other scholars. Usually I would start with the historiography of pre-modern critical race theory, but I feel like I'm kind of preaching to the choir today. So instead, I would just like to mention the works that have influenced my chapter that I'm going to talk about today, which is Labens and Spy-Gans, who have developed the historiography of the playing cards I'm going to talk about. But to use my time wisely, I want to skip straight to my case study today. So there are so many things that I could say about the playing cards I'm going to talk about today, but today I'm going to look at race making through Blackness specifically, and I'm not going to touch on any of these other points, unfortunately. So, seated upon an emerald chariot and led by 2 golden lions is a woman representing the early modern continent of Africa. Her skin is printed with a parallel hatched effect, which denotes her dark and possibly black skin. The only other coloration added to the print of her body is on her clothes and accessories, such as her crimson cape or her crown and parasol, the latter two suggesting wealth, power, and the exotic, with their depiction of brightly coloured feathers reminiscent of parrots. The print's depiction of her ornate jewellery stands as a stark contrast to her nudity, with her bare breasts outlined by these detailed decorations. This is a clear representation of sexualization and the othering of a continent displayed through the depiction of an African woman's body, and it creates an unsettling feeling for a contemporary historian who encounters these in the print collections in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. The Jeu de la Géographie is a set of 52 playing cards, a game which is made up of 4 suits depicting the 4 perceived continents of the world at this time: Africa, Europe, Asia, and the Americas. What would usually be the king in a traditional French-suited set of playing cards is, in this pack, a card representing a whole continent personified through royal-like figures in animal-led chariots, such as the card displayed above of Africa in the green chariot with 2 lions. Following this, each suit consists of 2 other court cards, the dames and valets, which correlate to the traditional queens and jacks. The other 10 cards which make up each suit are other countries in that continent depicted as women. This edition is average in size for playing cards at this time, making them both easy to handle and to print. The cards were ordered in 1644, it is said, by Cardinal Mazarin, possibly by the instruction of the Regent Queen Anne of Austria as a didactic gift for the young Louis XIV. The Jeu de la Géographie cards were one set among 4 in a collection of pedagogical games for the 5-year-old king. The others consisted of packs designed to educate him about the French kings, myths and fables, and famous queens. The cards fall into the Speculum Principis, a mirror for princes, inspired by Erasmus's tools for educating young royalty in preparation for rule. So what is pertinent from the instruction of the young king or others who own or play with these cards is the colours sometimes added by the watercolour painters. In the privilege, a document which proves that the printer, Henry Legras of Paris, had the permission of the king to reprint the cards, there is an explanation of the common colour combination for these paintings. The Europe suit is painted yellow or golden. The African suit is remarked for the blackness of the body of the figures represented. The Asian are columbine, and the Americas are recognized for the use of green and feathers of diverse colors. These color choices do not appear to be random, but as the result of a calculated decision with strong implications made about their correlating country. For example, the use of gold holds implication of wealth, monarchy, and spirituality, placing Europe as superior, or at the top of the hierarchy of these four parts of the world. With France being in Europe, this makes sense for their own pride, but it may also come from and contribute to the persistent Eurocentrism. But the clearest difference between the continental suits is the differentiation of the African cards by their clear racialization. The document explicitly highlights how the blackness of their bodies is what makes them recognizable, and it separates them by giving their body color rather than their clothes or accessories. They are the only group with color added to their bodies through etched shading. The other continents' countries' bodies are left without color. One can presume this is supposed to represent whiteness, which does not need to be emphasized or explained, as one can understand that whiteness here is a presumed norm. The use of blackness to distinguish Africans also puts the focus of difference on the people themselves, not the country, as the colour is used in reference to their skin, rather than as a metaphor for what the country or continent offers. It also stereotypes all African people together as black, despite the fact that the skin colour of people from African countries ranges in pigments. This repeats the association of blackness with Africanness, in an early modern attempt to racialise and other people of Africa directly through skin colour and blackness. This explicit racialization is important considering that the game was made for the education of young Louis, as it teaches him to categorize African people by the color of their bodies, highlighting their stereotyped blackness as different from the rest of the world. It establishes, for a mode of material culture, an early modern construction of race, which is shown here as an important factor in learning geography. Furthermore, the fact that this racialization is shown through the bodies of women does not come as a coincidence. Foucault writes about bodies being sites of power through the constructions of discourse, and the clear gendering of these allegorical countries in the playing cards adds to this power imbalance. Women's bodies hold discourses on religion, purity, sexuality, fertility, life, and possession, and through patriarchal power structures are seen as subservient to men. These bodily sites of power are clear in the Jeu de la Géographie, as the women anthropomorphizing European countries are in long covering robes and dresses, in comparison to those representing African countries, whose clothes appear more ragged and less tailored, often leaving their breasts exposed. This creates an idea that African bodies are perhaps more sexualized and accessible than Europeans, building on the idea of the association of white skin with purity. This sexualization may have also been to suit their audience, often male viewers, and in the case of this card pack, specifically the King of France, through sexual gratification, which could add to the print and card sales through the representation's allure. It's also a game designed, created, and envisioned by the male gaze, adding to its fetishism. It is fitting that these bodies are depicted on playing cards. The concepts of control and possession are intrinsic to a game of cards. Arguably, it does not seem a mistake that these female bodies were printed so that they could be held, collected, and played with. Board games and playing cards alike can become sites of hegemony, power, and domination. The use of women as countries is also important when considering issues such as war, exploration, and colonization. For example, when describing invasions, one might say that ranks or borders have been penetrated, which here, with the female representation, adds an element of sexual violence. Bethencourt calls this the gendered dream of conquest, with the depictions objectifying women as something to be owned and controlled, as both countries and playing cards are. However, when taking into consideration the fact that African or American countries represented in the cards are personified by women who are often less clothed and more highly sexualized, this dream of conquest can be understood as new desires for territory to be conquered or explored, as with the New World. Hierarchies and power imbalances between countries is seen in both the textual and visual aspects of these playing cards. This is especially present due to the fact that these cards were designed as diplomatic instructions for a young king to educate him on relationships between certain countries with others and with the world and France. The descriptions of each country suggest their use for France and apply a colonial strategy, dividing the four continents by agricultural, cultural, and economic benefits. For example, Europe is described as fertile and known for its valor, civility, and science, whereas Africa is sterile and whose people are black or swarthy. Interestingly, Africa is the only continent whose people are physically described, implying the importance of racialization, skin color, and blackness when it comes to Africa's people. The cards use black or swarthy as a generalization for all Africans, insisting on the correlation between blackness and Africanness. Additionally, by highlighting specifically the blackness of the African people, it suggests that blackness is worth mentioning as it breaks from the norm, which is implicitly whiteness for French Europeans. It establishes whiteness as the norm for the world, placing black Africans as the others and the odd ones out within the continents. Although racialization can be applied to South Americans, Indigenous Americans, and Asians, these are not highlighted through skin difference in the playing cards, neither through the descriptions nor the etched imagery, revealing Africans as the only people worth racializing through skin color at this time. What is also noteworthy is the specific terms used to describe their blackness. Although black is a common description, swarthy holds implications that their blackness or darker skin color is not from birth, but developed, that it is gained from too much sun exposure and from living in hotter climates, but also from a lower social standing as peasants or laborers who are forced to work outdoors, unlike the elite classes who gain whiteness from privilege. In Fruitier's Dictionary of 1690, he writes that basané can be used in the context the peasants are usually tanned and swarthy, supporting the correlation of being swarthy with peasantry. These connotations thence align Black Africans with a lower social class, or even a sense of lower race in a pre-racial world. This definition reminds one of the importance of intersectional research and that social standing also forms part of the construction of race, not just skin colour. In this example, racialization is formed from a difference in skin colour, which is perceived to have been created for a lower social standing. The role of social standing in hierarchies and racialization is very pertinent for France, as Jennifer Palmer argues that in 17th and 18th century France, rank, lineage, and noble bloodline were the most important factors in hierarchization, which by default often placed Black Africans at the bottom. It is clear that these cards teach that racial difference is formed through a combination of skin colour, which at the same time is a reflection equally of social standing difference, placing Black Africans below white Europeans in terms of both class and equally race. So this pack of cards reveals the importance of material culture for understanding pre-modern race-making and displays the intersectional factors that form these racial constructions. I want to say thanks very much for listening, and the QR code is the link to the cards on Gallica, the French archives. So if you want to look through the cards while you're waiting the questions, please have a look. Thank you.
Thanks, Amber. That was wonderful. Oh, thank you for also putting up the gallery. You can also put that in the chat if you want, so people can go through the cards. They're such fascinating objects. That was a great presentation. So next up is Niyanta Sangal, who comes from the University of Maryland. It's good to see you. I'll let you take it away, Niyanta.
Hi, Lia. Thank you so much for this. I'll just share my presentation first. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining my presentation and hearing me talk about this presentation, which is my very early sort of attempt in trying to think about cross-cultural context, trying to connect Mughal empire with early modern literature. My presentation would look at Dryden's Aureng-zebe and how it appropriates early modern travel accounts, which circulated in early modern England from Mughal India to portray an Orientalist gendered embodiment through its various characters. My presentation will explore the play as an appropriation that relies on various sources, including representations of Mughal art, to further this gender variance. I will particularly trace the iconography of Noor Jahan's cross-dressing as a potentially varied gendered third space that Dryden utilizes to cast Noor Mahal, a derivation of Noor Jahan, as a masculine figure. Dryden in his play Aureng-zebe resurrects the historical figure of Aureng-zebe's grandfather's influential wife, Noor Mahal, as the fictional empress, queen to the old emperor, and presents her as a whirlwind of passion and faction, who, because of her husband's neglect, turns her amatory attention to Aureng-zebe, finally taking her own life with poison when her desires, political and amorous, are frustrated. Dryden also invents two other female characters that are not known in the historical accounts, a captive Kashmiri queen named Indamora, who is in love with Aureng-zebe, but pursued by both his father and brother, and Melisenda, virtuous wife to Murat, who chooses to perform sati on his death, despite his cruel rejection of her in favor of Indamora. To listeners who are not aware of sati as a practice, sati is basically the self-immolation of a wife on the pyres of her husband on his death. Dryden's source Bernier, as Bridget Orr has pointed out, not only provided him with plot elements but also the suggestion that Mughal history could be understood as a dramatic, especially tragic narrative. Moreover, the role of women as secret agents in plotting was highlighted by Bernier as well as it had been by Rowe. Dryden takes his cue from Bernier's characterization of Mughal court as a scene of spectacular and dramatic action in which women were major, if often invisible, players. It is interesting to note why Noor Jahan appears in this play despite her being historically removed from the political scene in Aureng-zebe's rule. Coupled with the ideas of exoticization of the Mughal harem, along with the accounts of Noor Jahan's powerful persona in Jahangir's court, I argue that the Empress's martial prowess, along with her androgynous portrayal in Mughal paintings, becomes the foundation of her masculinization in Dryden's play. Ruby Lal, in her book Empress on Noor Jahan, establishes how some European commentators framed her as cunning and conniving. Thomas Roe, the British ambassador to Jahangir's court, saw Noor as manipulative and mysterious. Jahangir's court is directed by a woman and is now, as it were, shut up by her, so that all justice or care of anything or public affairs either sleeps or depends on her, who is more inaccessible than any goddess or mystery of heathen impiety. This is directly taken from Thomas Roe's account. In the view of Peter Mundy, a merchant with the British East India Company who visited Agra in 1630, he suggested that Noor was haughty and stomachful, that is, stubborn. Europeans like Roe and Mundy seemed specially bewildered by the phenomena of Noor Jahan. She hadn't inherited an empire, as had Queen Elizabeth I of England, crowned 20 years before Noor's birth, nor was she exactly a favorite, the familiar advisor minister figure they knew, a staple of European courts, but always a male. They couldn't quite wrap their minds around a woman's coming to power because of her prowess, because of her own talents, but they could understand a wily consort winning the indulgence of a love-blind emperor. Dryden's play self-consciously stages the Mughal court then along the lines of these theatrical renderings by European travelers of the Eastern court. But he also radically transforms and relocates plot elements. Why did Dryden take such liberties with recent Indian history? Numerous hypotheses have been put forward by critics. Thus, Nandini Bhattacharya concludes that Dryden's aim was to present Aureng-zebe as a plausible submissive object of colonial domination. Virtuous characters such as Aureng-zebe, Melisenda, and Indamora are presented as open to control by others, nascent subaltern figures who already subscribe to the bourgeois, affective, and trade-dominated civil values of Western Europe, which will eventually unseat the corrupt, lust-driven, and self-interested Oriental despotism embodied in the old emperor, his wife, and his youngest son. She summarizes the play as a culturally conditioned attempt to portray a non-Western culture as essentially more fragile and vulnerable, embodying certain polarized stereotypes, gender identities, and therefore seeming a fair target for penetration in comparison. Dryden presents the women in the play as embodiments of a homogenized Indianness, distinguished only by the contrast between the lust-driven queen, familiar to the period, Noor Mahal, and the virtuous devoted wife and or mistress, Melisenda Indamora. Noor Mahal and Aureng-zebe are quick to lead to judgment as a result of their sexual frustration and security, and both use a language of sexual conquest and covetousness expressed in terms of the dream. Noor Mahal undertakes to act as Aureng-zebe's guard or executioner, but instead takes the opportunity to lead him to a scene of Oriental luxury and lavishness she has prepared for his attempted seduction. Dryden's Orientalized depiction of Noor Mahal becomes disrupted and complicated by turning our attention to 17th century artistic depictions of her historical counterpart, Noor Jahan. Her iconography in Mughal art shows that a watercolor painting currently held in the collection at the Rampur Raza Library in Rampur, Uttar Pradesh, in India, depicts a single figure sporting a golden musket, a turban, and jewels. The individual stands erect and imposing before a sparse green background. At first glance, the posture, costume, and accessories make this person appear to be a nobleman. However, upon closer inspection, one notices that the figure is female, provided the slight indication of breasts, a fact that is confirmed by the title attributed to the work, Noor Jahan holding a musket. Completed at the Mughal court in Agra, India, during the reign of Emperor Jahangir, that is from 1605 to 1627, Noor Jahan holding a musket. From here on, Noor Jahan is a relatively small work executed on a 98 by 50 paperboard and mounted to a folio. It features Empress Noor Jahan, the only co-sovereign in the history of the Mughal Empire, who earned this rank in 1611 through her marriage to Jahangir as his 20th and last wife. The portrait of Noor Jahan appears within a muraka, an album of paintings, facing a second portrait on the shared recto side that is similar to it in subject and in style, featuring a male figure. This male is possibly a son of Jahangir, Noor Jahan's husband. The portrait bears the signature of the court painter Abul Hasan, one of Jahangir's favorite portrait artists known for his naturalistic style of painting. The title awarded to Abul Hasan as well as Shah Jahan's antagonism towards Noor Jahan allows us to safely date the painting to a period during the final 9 years of Noor Jahan's rule. Jahangir's memoir, the Jahangir-nama, or the Book of Jahangir, in which the emperor chronicled his reign, told his accounts of early events and encounters such as royal celebrations, visits by ambassador, and hunting feasts, and recorded his observation of the natural world, contains important clues about Noor Jahan. In two passages from Jahangir's memoir, the emperor describes his wife as a tiger slayer. This favorable analogy written by Jahangir between 1617 and 1620 and his interest in visually recording contemporary events supports the attribution of the painting to a time during Noor Jahan's lifetime, when she was known to be an active hunter, displaying her prowess among the male members of the court. The painting by Abul Hasan portrays Noor Jahan as a powerful, confident figure wearing androgynous attire and holding a musket. This depiction is striking for two reasons. First, not only does it appear to be the only extant portrait of Noor Jahan that represents her in the guise of a man, but my research has revealed that no other Mughal portrait that displays a woman in this manner. Second, and significantly, for a history of Mughal female portraiture, this representation contradicts depictions of Noor Jahan found in Mughal legends. These legends describe Noor Jahan in conventional terms as an empress whose beauty, grace, and nurturing nature are noted as her greatest assets. In Abul Hasan's portrayal, on the other hand, Noor Jahan is a martial woman who deliberately and effectively conceals her femininity. Today, many of Abul Hasan's works are dispersed among museums across the world, and images of them are not immediately available. However, one painting titled Jahangir giving a cup of wine to a young woman, subsequently a cup of wine and dated to the early 17th century, is preserved inside a muraka. The painting depicts a young royal woman who is being served wine by Jahangir. Interestingly, she is wearing the masculine turban seen on Noor Jahan. The woman's profile view, her stature, and the small but important details suggest the identity of the anonymous young woman in the painting to be none other than Noor Jahan. The turban that Noor Jahan is once again seen wearing was reserved for men, as women wore it only occasionally inside the zanana in private. The bright vermilion of Noor Jahan's turban catches the viewer's attention, leading to her breast and slender waist wrapped by her chadar jama. A chadar jama is a traditional article of clothing at the Mughal court. It is a robe with 4 points made of malmal or silk muslin, as seen here worn by Noor Jahan. Under her jama, Noor Jahan wears a cadmium red pajamas trimmed in gold and golden slippers. Both figures sport kalgi tucked into their turbans, luxurious golden embroidered patkas around their waist and indicating their royalty. Despite her unmistakable royal status, as Abul Hasan placed her on a pedestal, elevating her to nearly the height of Jahangir, he pays due respect to the emperor by positioning him still slightly higher. In both depictions of Noor Jahan, the figure possesses a distinguished spirit that challenges the ethos of 17th century Mughal India in regard to women. The portraits of Noor Jahan by Abul Hasan exhibit a lesser known side of the empress. Her characterization breaks free from the tradition of showing the empress as merely an adoring and dutiful wife, as she is portrayed in such works as Jahangir and Prince Khurram entertained by Noor Jahan, and Noor Jahan holding a portrait of Emperor Jahangir by the painter Bishan Das. The former work records an event from 1617 in Mandu where Noor Jahan served as hostess, honoring her stepson and one of his military conquests. While the scene is set in a female space, the zanana or the harem, and Noor Jahan shares the center of the scene with Jahangir, She is shown in a typical female role as entertainer. Similarly, the second portrait by Vishen Das also illustrates her as an utterly romanticized vision of the Empress in keeping with the centuries-old tradition of depicting women with ample bosoms, tiny waist, long flowing hair, and alluring sensuality. As a patron of Mughal artists, Jahangir took an active role in the works being produced in his court, and it is likely that he was aware and consented to Noor Jahan's portraits by both the artists. In Abul Hassan's depiction, Noor Jahan is displayed as possessing more than usual power that is given to an empress, and these traits allow one to study Noor Jahan as part of the powerful lineage of royal Muslim women. As the following discussion will try to demonstrate, in the pre-modern Islamic world, cross-dressing was a strategy employed by women to showcase their physical strength, intelligence, and political as well as military might, both in history and literature. I will skip this part, but suffice to say this is a representation of Razia Sultana, the only female Mamluk Sultan of the Delhi Sultanate in the medieval period. And she was a warrior daughter, similar to how we see depictions of Noor Jahan in Mughal art. I'm just going to skip this and just move on to my discussion on the English travel accounts. The next portrait that I'm sharing here has been brought to England and then compiled by the cleric Samuel Purchin in his 1619 collection of travel stories. The page contains 3 figures in full length, which appear to have been created as individual portraits originally and pastiched together in this reproduction. Labels penned in English identify the figures as Salim Shah the Great Mughal, that is Jahangir, to the right Sultan Quran, that is Prince Khurram, to the left, and placed between the two men is his Jahangir's slave woman. Interestingly, the woman is outfitted for war. It is possibly that the original works published in this print were brought to England by Rowe. Rowe's relationship with the Mughal court and more directly with Jahangir and Noor Jahan suggests that he might have received artworks as gifts from the royal couple in exchange for procuring English works of art for them. In light of the letters written by Rowe regarding Noor Jahan's intervention in establishing trade relations between the English and Mughals, it is safe to assume that Rowe procured the image with the knowledge that it represented the royal family. His slave woman then would be none other than Noor Jahan. The print juxtaposes the 3 figures as symbols of empire. And we see that the kind of symbols that each of the figures are holding, only Noor Jahan has been given a symbol that is the sword and the battle axe, which is the symbol of martial prowess again. Within the context of pre-modern Islamic cultures, it follows that donning men's clothes does not alone make one a man. Within the confines of gender binaries, there existed many outliers who occupied a third space. Noor Jahan's cross-dressing was a performance of power. Indrani Chatterjee, in her discussion of bodies in South Asia before the 18th century, suggests that a vast literary and aesthetic corpus spoke of adulterous, erotic yearnings of mutably gendered beings, of gods who came as ordinary customers to haggle over a courtesan's fees, of the enjoined feminization of all biologically male devotees of Krishna or Shiva, themes of sexual indeterminacy bound Eastern Indian Vaishnava poetics from the 16th century to their Sufi counterparts in Punjab and the Deccan, well into the late 18th century. There was certainly no hegemonic idealization of heterosexist conjugal being or pathologies of dimorphic sexual personalities. Yet these ideas had been institutionalized by the power of colonial era law and the seductions of colonially generated goods and markets. The institutionalization of gender and sexuality by colonialism invites closer study of Noor Jahan's leveraging masculine power through her self-fashioning as an androgynous figure in these paintings, which exceeds the bounds of strictly coded masculinity or femininity. Simultaneously, these analyses need to move beyond the orientalized placement of Jahangir as an indulgent and effeminized emperor while taking into account the power that Noor Jahan held in the Mughal court. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Niyanta. Fascinating materials. It's great to see these connections dealing with gender and race, the intersectional content in both of these talks so far. Okay, so next we have up Ronique Gillis from Western University. Welcome. Good to see you.
Hi. Let me just share my screen. Okay, and can everyone see that? Great.
Or you could turn it on so it's slideshow, so it's bigger
Yeah.
for us, yeah. Perfect,
Okay, is that good? Okay.
perfect, thank
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'd like to first give my thanks and appreciation to the organizers of the symposium and fellow panelists. As I'm still in the planning stages as a doctoral student, I'm here to present a very rough schematic of one of my dissertation chapters. As a Black woman whose known ancestry is rooted in Guyana, a former British colony, and currently residing in a settler Canadian on the unceded territories of various Indigenous nations, my identity is one bred from complexities. I take a moment to offer my positionality statement here to clearly outline not only where I position myself, but more importantly, to adequately center the investigations that follow. The Black body and Black ontological position, or Blackness, has been largely defined and determined by white people and its proximity to whiteness, especially where our history is concerned. The figurative and literal positioning of Black people and their identity or identities is fixed in positions Black people have occupied in social, cultural, and historical contexts. When referencing positionalities, I'm referring to Black identity and memory, both individual and collective. Black identity, Blackness, and Black memory are co-constitutive and thus hold a fluid relationship. This paper deploys positionality as an investigative tool that examines the polarities between historical and contemporary Black identity or identities in artworks and how the clash between past and present creates turmoil when Black people determine their identity. Instigated by essays gleaned from Vance Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks, and Bell Hook's Art on My Mind, Visual Politics, this paper examines the neoclassical interpretations of the Black body or Black bodies and Blackness in John Singleton Copley's The Death of Major Pearson, the 6th of January, 1781, painted between 1782 and 1784, in juxtaposition with Melissa Bisa Butler's contemporary quilted art practice. This juxtaposition looks at Butler's work as sites of resilience, protest, and celebration as a response to racialized historical interpretations of the Black positionality. I first talk about Copley's visualization of the Black body and proceed with Butler's interpretations of Black ontology in her art. Through confronting past and present identities and its intricate relationships to power via an anti-oppressive lens, my examination of colonial representations of power challenges the art historical depictions of the Black body and Blackness visualized by the white patriarchal European. Typically seen in Western European and North American artworks are visualizations of the Black male body relegated to the role of the object while interacting with the white male body. As such, the scholarship surrounding critical race theory and feminist theory tends to focus discussions on this interaction between the racialized male body as wholly colonized and the white European male body as the colonizer or main signifier of the differing forms of power. While I address the Black male body and this colonial dialectic in my dissertation, I will also place emphasis on the Black female body, as well as the depiction of Black community or togetherness. I examine the gap in CRT and feminist literature, where there is a proven lack of dialogue pertaining to the Black neoclassical body and its ontological position, especially as they converse with contemporary Black art and art practices. Bisa Butler's artistic practice operates as a site of, quote, duality and or dueling, end quote, as defined in Ibram X. Kendi's Stamped from the Beginning. Black visual representation grants its viewers, especially its Black viewers, with the ability to ascribe their identity in both past and present artworks. Therein lies Kendi's, quote, dual and dueling history of racial progress and the simultaneous progression of racism, end quote. Kendi identifies this duality/dueling embodied by Stamped from the Beginning as the book is not a single linear historical dialogue, but instead operates as a dual telling of both histories, as there is not one without the other. Butler's quilted works are therefore visualizations of realized and, to some extent, idealized identities that recognized their autonomy and agency. As a part of my proposed dissertation chapter, I also want to utilize her quilted artworks to investigate a mode of Black gender duality that takes place and how the artist's use of quilts work to both deconstruct old formations of Black identity while constructing, in addition to celebrating new and or existing elements of Black identity. Due to the sake of time and my methodological choice to decenter the discussion of traditional neoclassical characteristics in Copley's work, I will not be providing a full biography of Copley. I've opted to include this slide to offer a very brief synopsis instead. I move on to The Death of Major Pearson, one of Copley's most highly acclaimed paintings. This monumental oil painting is a commemoration of the heroic death of Major Francis Pearson, a British officer, who fell during the Battle of Jersey in 1781. The battle depicted here had been a part of the American Revolutionary War, in which a large fraction of Britain's colonies in America were looking to establish themselves as a nation of their own. Copley had painted one of the key events in the battle mid-action when Major Pearson was shot by a French sharpshooter. The African figure, Pearson's servant in military dress, had avenged Pearson by returning a fatal shot to the French sharpshooter seen on the right-hand side of the background. In addition to this, Copley has included an active depiction of Pearson's family fleeing the scene. Historical paintings such as Copley's highlighted the use of the artistic medium as propagandic imagery that served to contort the narratives of the events in a way that would garner favor among those loyal to the continuance of the British Empire. This paper looks at Butler's quilting practice in particular and its intersections as a historically female object of cultural, social, and political significance that confronts Copley's neoclassical visualization of the Black body and Blackness. Hailing from Orange, New Jersey, Bisa Butler is an African-American textile artist recognized for her vibrant, monumental quilted portraits of Black people. Butler's artistic inspiration is drawn from her mother and grandmother, both of whom taught her how to sew. Her work encapsulates various realms of Black identity, which are reimagined as sites of protest, resilience, and celebration, rather than sites of fetishization, inferiority, and spectacle of Black anguish. My investigation has found the utilization of this textile craft in the contemporary setting as very closely aligned with photographic renderings of Black body and being as sites of reference that contain altered iconographic motifs. Butler's body of quilted artworks were specifically chosen as the center of this discussion due to their innovative visualizations of the Black body and identity formation via portraiture. There's difficulty in creating what Bell Hooks calls, quote, counter-hegemonic art, end quote, due to the fact that there are few repositories of Black diasporic art or Black traditions for Black artists to draw on, which in turn means that they have to be critically conscious of their work and the meaning they invoke in order to remove themselves from the colonially entrenched methods of art making. The profundity of the lessons passed down from prior generations displays the reclamation of individual and familial, perhaps ancestral power, as it acts as a catalyst for determining the identity of the self. The sewing lessons and determinations of self-identity intertwine to become tangible in depictions of Black Americans in the quilted artworks Butler creates. Her quilts present an abstract twist on traditional portraiture as they are dynamically woven in various vibrant and saturated tones. These fabrics forego realistic elements, namely the hyper-focus on skin color, most commonly observed in traditional neoclassical portraiture as a necessary detour from the fixed objectifications attributed to Blackness and Black identity under the white gaze. The drastic change in elements produce shock values as we, the viewer, observe and analyze each work. Though I am to look at her entire portrait series, I will detail one quilted work in this presentation to give you all a sense of how Butler configures her works. In I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, created in 2019, Butler literally supplants symbolic references to Black liberation in a number of motifs. She asserts, quote, all four figures act out the caged bird syndrome. They do so through their poses, their clothing, and their spirit of sisterhood. This is their coming out, just like the release of the caged bird. The bird in the cage on the girl's arm, the third girl's arm, illustrates the words of Dr. Maya Angelou's poem, "These girls have used education to set themselves free," end quote. Though the iconographic rendering of the birds requires the viewer to search for them, they are at the forefront, one located at the center of the hat on the first woman on the far left, while the other reference is found on the sleeve of the second woman from the right. Butler references a photograph dated 1899-1900 of four young African-American women who are sat on the steps of Atlanta College. Their visualization is stimulating as they are pictured as, quote, braggadocious and supremely confident, end quote, a stark contradiction of the environment and time period they exist in. Additionally, Butler delves into the notion of temporality via her choice of figures, fabrics, and most notably the titles of her artworks. In doing so, her quilts powerfully resonate in the present while calling attention to colonial erasures of the past. I'll just end off here. I currently question how and why the removal of the Black body from their original setting furthers its politicization as it is an act that is deeply entrenched in social relations that transpires outside of a fixed time, or rather a fixed history. Going forward, I want to delve more into one, Black imaginaries as realities, two, the intersections between color, saturation, and race, and lastly, the power of the gaze and the reproduction of spectacle. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Thank you so much, Ronique. I look forward to discussing this further with you in the Q&A. Incredible material. Again, we just saw some of this at the Art Institute when there was an amazing show of her work. Okay, next up we have Laura Lopez Zunzunegu, and I'm afraid I'm mispronouncing it. Laura, help me out here. Who's from the Universidad Nacional de Educación a Distancia. Again, you can help me pronounce that as well, but thanks for being here.
Don't worry, I don't know why I can't initiate the video. It says like the host stopped it.
Oh, strange. Okay, let me fix it. Oh, there we go.
Oh, thank you. Perfect. Now, yeah. Yeah, don't worry about my surname stuff. No one can pronounce it well, so I'm gonna share the presentation. Yeah. So I'm gonna talk in this presentation.
Yeah.
We will discuss how the concept of race is reconstructed and represented in art exhibitions, particularly how this reconstruction varies depending on the country where the museological discourse is designed. How does the construction or even defense of national identity influence the concept of race? How are identity and difference intertwined? Why and how does this relationship change from one country to another? The first point to address is defining what we mean when we talk about race. To answer this question and understand the core issue of this conference, we must first discern where we are talking about race. Both the academic field and the social context are crucial to understanding how the world is viewed and how the past is analyzed. In our case, to grasp the differences between Spain and the United States, the two countries that are the focus of this conference, we could start with something as basic yet complex as terminology, the use of race versus otherness. I experienced the importance of this distinction firsthand when I arrived in the United States about a year ago for a research day. In Spain, I had already been researching about otherness, but upon arriving in the US, my advisor and other colleagues told me that otherness was seen as something kind of outdated from the 90s back in the US. I began reading about these issues and about race in the US, and I could understand why they could be right. Curiously, upon returning to Spain a few months ago, I could not talk about race in the early modern period without hearing, but we have to be careful about anachronisms. This marked difference is clearly reflected in museums and makes the comparative construction of race a fascinating topic to delve into. For instance, one of the most recent books on the subject in Spanish, De Sangre y Leche, Raza y Religión en el Mundo Ibérico Moderno, by Felipe Pereda Mercedes García Arenal, was in its introduction against applying American historiographies of race to European context, as this could lead to anachronisms when applying race too early in time. In contrast, American scholar Kim Hall asserts that there is no longer any doubt that the concept of race began developing not only in the early modern period but also in the Middle Ages. This significant leap from one academic tradition to another is evident. While we will explore several exhibitions, for this specific example, it is fitting to discuss the Sin Race Before Race exhibition at the Newberry Library and El Espejo Perdido at the Museo del Prado. The former was my first encounter with this new concept of race, which I had not access to during my Spanish education. The title itself alludes to the difficulty in defining the concept, speaking to explain it of a racial matrix. Following this concept, race can encompass multiple dimensions in this exhibition: phenotype, clothing, attitudes, etc. So what determines what constitutes race and what does not? And Daya, one of the curators, explains the structural construction of power behind the definition. For example, if an Arab merchant's clothing is defined by an Englishman attempting to create a compendium of other peoples in a travel narrative, one could argue that race is being constructed. This approach successfully defines the creation of the concept without overly restricting it and addresses the core characteristic of othering, which leads to the creation of race as a means of separating one identity from another, the presence of power determining who belongs to a group or race and who does not. It also acknowledges the evolving nature of academia in understanding this application of power through discrimination. On the other hand, we have El Espejo Perdido. The Prado is Spain's largest national museum and also known as a traditional institution. When an exhibition about the image of Jews in the medieval and early modern periods was announced, it was considered a step forward in highlighting alternative histories beyond the dominant narrative of Spain's formation. However, the exhibition reflects its title, A Mirror of Otherness, presenting the other. Upon reading the catalogue, one finds mention of the concept of race in only 2 chapters, each time accompanied by clarifications about the problematic nature of its use and the intention to avoid anachronisms. The exhibition barely touches the construction of race and focuses instead on the construction of otherness, creating a historical gap that disconnects past discrimination from the present. This contrast underscores Hen's assertion that using otherness instead of race creates a distant past disconnected from the present. In contrast, race allows us to trace the threads of differentiation as a power structure, which, though evolving, remains recognizable in modern-day systems of social discrimination. Knowing this theoretical background, the presentation will now examine specific samples from the other US exhibitions between 2023 and 2024, such as Archive of the World from LACMA and Unnamed Figures from the Folk Art Museum in New York City, and compare them with Spanish exhibitions, analyzing how national identity has shaped these differences. We have chosen for this case the LACMA exhibition because it takes a somewhat different approach compared to the rest that we talked about. Here, the focus is not on otherness or race itself, but rather on the construction of race as a tangential aspect, inseparable from the cultural melting pot that formed the context in which the displayed art emerged. There is a particularly interesting section for our analysis, Fashioning the Self, which primarily explores how identity could be asserted through clothing. In this section, we see several works, such as the screen from the previous slide, Biombo con Desposorio Indígena, depicting pre-Hispanic rituals like the Palo Volador alongside a Christian wedding ceremony, offering a multifaceted portrayal of identity and difference. We also find traditional ponchos embroidered with Spanish motif and, finally, casta paintings. These paintings illustrate the racial categories imposed on this multicultural society, distinctions that would have been difficult to perceive in reality, based solely on skin color, given the blending within the population. As such, these differences were reinforced through clothing, bringing us back to the section's title, Fashioning the Self, and also bringing us back to the racial matrix concept. On the other hand, we have the Unnamed Figures exhibition. The title itself reveals the motivation of its curator, Emily Gewalt, who elaborates on it in the catalogue. In her introduction, she discusses the black figure depicted in the artwork we see on screen, Perry Hall. This painting portrays the Dorsicock family strolling alongside a black woman. As Gewalt points out, we know the names of all the white individuals depicted here and even the name of the horse behind them, but not that of the black woman holding the child's hand. It was this woman who inspired the creation of this exhibition. The exhibition seeks to recover the identities of these depicted figures wherever possible, and when it isn't, to get as close as possible, at least sparking reflection or debate about who they might have been. For both general and academic audiences, this show opens a dialogue about the limits of research on the absent and humanizes individuals portrayed in works that might otherwise remain unknown to visitors or overlooked on other occasions. We believe this approach is not only appropriate but essential. Even if the results are inconclusive, the very effort to pull the thread is valuable, if only because the attempt to uncover their identities restores a measure of memory to these individuals lost to time. In the next slide, we see 2 exhibitions. An American exhibition, Juan de Pareja, at the Met, included here because of its significant impact in Spain and the opportunity of comparison between the 2 countries' reception of the topic, and the Spanish La Memoria Colonial at the Thyssen Museum. The Juan de Pareja exhibition focused on the life and work of this artist who had been enslaved by Velázquez, sparked extensive media coverage in Spain due to the origins of the painter. What resonated most and prompted considerable debate in Spain was the addition of Afro-Hispanic to describe the artist. Spanish scholars and critics argued that that was impossible to determine, while American reviews defended the attempt to find the story of the painter through that lens, giving representation where there was so little. This also had to do with a painting by Pareja held at the Prado, but never really given importance there. In it, we find a different representation of Pareja from that of Velázquez, his self-portrait. An engaging debate arose on both sides of the Atlantic about which version of the artist should prevail. For instance, some critics considered it a mistake that the exhibition appeared to give more importance to Velázquez's representation of Pareja than to the self-portrait that Pareja himself painted, which we now see on screen. Comparing the two, we can observe notable differences. In Velázquez's work, racialized features are more pronounced, whereas in Pareja's self-portrait, he portrays himself with lighter skin. The fact that Spain had already been a cultural and civilizational melting pot for centuries meant that a more racialized appearance was not seen that truly unusual. Here are also some excerpts from some reviews about the exhibition. On the left, a fairly critical review from El País, a Spanish newspaper, and on the right, a very positive review from the New York Times. The Spanish review focuses primarily on the labeling of Juan de Pareja, labeling between quotes, while the New York Times praise focuses on how this identification improves representation. The most interesting issue here, in my opinion, is how the Afro-Hispanic term caused so much response in Spain, where American exhibitions usually don't have a tenth part of this attention. On the other hand, we have the Thyssen exhibition, which the museum itself describes as a first step toward decolonizing its collection. In my opinion, it is exactly that, a first step in a journey that requires much more depth. Nevertheless, it marks a significant beginning for a subject that had not been previously addressed in Spain. The exhibition includes several strong points, such as exposing the imperialist origins and intentions of works that were previously viewed in the museum through a different lens. For example, landscapes of America painted by European colonizers. If we talk about what further steps could be taken, however, we could look towards the Unnamed Figures exhibition. At the Thyssen, the exploration of the history of the marginalized is noticeably absent, as the narrative still focuses on the perspective of either the artist or the patron, without giving greater prominence to the real person behind the European interpretation. However, this is not surprising in a context so resistant to changes of this nature, as we will see in the next slide. Here we have a review about the Thyssen exhibition. This show received much negative press, mostly centered on the word decolonization. We see in this slide a provocative headline from an article that goes on even blaming the US influence for modifying history and adapting the past to current concerns. Again, we see the disconnect between the past and the present. This eagerness to disconnect past from present and ignore decolonialism shouldn't surprise given the fact that Spain remains one of the last countries in Europe that still hasn't issued an apology for its crime in colonial times. Thus, we can see that different countries approach the concept of race in entirely different ways, both academically and socially, with reasons and consequences unique to each context. We can perceive the differences when there is a past that is not assumed nor accepted, and thus should be ignored or at least disconnected from the present to make it make sense. These consequences are most evident in museum art exhibitions, where the academic world of art and history interacts most closely with society, and where identity can be easily created.
Thank you, Laura. Wonderful to get this summation of these recent exhibitions and their very complex contexts. I have a lot of questions for all of you. This has been a fantastic panel, which has beautifully put together various issues related to visualizing race, not only today, not only in the past, but really today as well, and how essentially we should be thinking about these works from the past in relationship to the present. So I'm going to just ask the four of you if you have questions for each other first, and I'm going to invite our other panelists and participants to either put questions in the Q&A or use the chat or pop in if you're a panelist and raise your hand. So any of those methods work. But I'll let you all talk amongst yourselves first if you'd like. I can also jump in and ask a sort of general question of you all. I have like nitty-gritty questions for each of you, but I guess maybe thinking about, I'll come back to Drew, but thinking maybe about Laura's last presentation, her her presentation. And this issue of thinking about race differently in different areas of the world is, I think, really essential for our discussion today. And is one reason we wanted to do this on Zoom and to get people from across the world to come and speak together. So I'm really excited that you provoked us with this issue. So I wonder if anybody else would like to speak on this issue in particular in relationship to their own work and their own struggles with their research, especially in terms of cross-cultural exchange and reception, which you're all dealing with in really fascinating ways.
I can start us off. I think that's a very thoughtful question, Leah, because oftentimes we don't really talk about what happens behind the scenes when you're doing this research, which is something that I've only realized that talking to scholars and hearing about their experiences is always very helpful. For me, the archival research often provokes a very, as so many others would, of course, have experienced this or would experience this whenever they interact with an archive that's now situated in a different context. So most of the Mughal archives that I work with are not in India. And that makes that situation, or that, that my ability to access these archives very complicated. So oftentimes you would not even have the resources to do that. I was very lucky that in the summer my department supported me and I could actually visit India and look at some of these archives, at least in part. But given that it's so scattered, there is no perfect way for me to do this research, because that would just entail so much travel, and how much work and resources do we have to actually develop one paper. We're lucky to be able to get that kind of time and money to be able to conduct these things to the degree that would really warrant or is warranted by these projects. So I think that's something that I realized that is going to be a constant challenge. But among other things, is just having to explain this like contextual information, thinking about audience. I think especially if you're a scholar from a country like India. I've recently moved to the US, so sort of I'm still trying to situate my voice to an American audience, and that brings its own sets of challenges in terms of writing conventions. How do you explain certain things? What requires explanation or translation? So there are so many of these things that become so complicated, and I'm still trying to figure out how to, work with that, because there's such a big confrontation in terms of thinking about whenever I write, it's a very UK style, of writing, and the American way of writing or conventions are just absolutely different. So that's the biggest critique that I keep getting. So I'm still working through it. I have very complex feelings about this because I don't necessarily agree that one style is better over the other. So I'm still trying to figure out what works for me, which I don't know if I would have the luxury to think about as all in any way, because I'll have to conform to write my dissertation. So again, one of the very budding kind of things that very basic early things that you kind of experience in terms of figuring out how to work cross-culturally.
Thanks, Niyanta. Any other panelists want to respond?
Yeah, I could actually kind of like echo
Go
what
ahead.
Niyanta had just said, because like I'm first generation, well, first generation scholar, so I'm like the first one doing this within my family. So to have or to enter into these spaces and sort of also work within like your lived experience and within the academic experience, and like finding like that balance and mix has been it's been a trial, but it's also very rewarding work I found, and also with the finding of resources as well, like that has been like a major hump for me because of the lack of access, not only to like the physical material, but like having to it's essentially like a maze or a map of linking one to the other, and just essentially trying to find where to locate these resources. It's rewarding work, and like I'm happy to do it, obviously, because I'm here. But yeah, like that, having to navigate through these spaces it's been something. So I could definitely relate heavily to what you're saying there, Niyanta.
Thanks. Yeah, I think what's been interesting is that you all are working with the same, theories and methods, but in such different contexts. So any other responses, Amber or Laura, before we go on to more questions?
Yeah, I think I said a lot in the presentation, but I also wanted to agree with Niyanta that I don't think there's like a method that is purely better than the other, but it's curious that there's no more like a fusion of different methods, because I see that so many academics are so set in their ideas. And I'm not talking like about people that have been in the academia for 30 years. I mean, people that is doing their PhDs. Sometimes I like, no, the real academia is the Spanish one, or the real academia is the American one. And I think that's one of the most difficult things. And if you try to speak like an American language in Spain, they just not gonna listen to you. Like I learned that like trying to talk about race, and I realized if I said other, I get like really better reactions. So I think it's so difficult to change, and I think that's something that needs to change. So, yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Laura.
I would also say, like, for me, it's a mix because I'm studying in Italy in a European university in Italy, but right now I'm doing my exchange in Paris, and so I've been trying to present my work here, and I'm really struggling. I mean, my French is hit and miss, but the main issue is actually translating things, and I tend to keep using the English words like blackness and race because the translation in French is not quite the same, and their understanding of the historiography of race and what race means is completely different. So I've been really struggling working out how to translate these things and to talk to different countries about my topic. So I think that connects as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, this is something we in our center discuss all the time, and with Noemi as well, quite a bit. So, okay, we have a question from Drew and Elisa, and I see we also have a question in the Q&A. So we'll call on Drew first and work our way through. Good to see you back, Drew. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all for like really, really awesome questions. And this question was inspired by Laura's presentation, but I think can like work for everybody's. Something I'm really fascinated with is as PCRS scholars, we come up with our theories and methodology, but to some extent, we can also weaponize like the previous historiography, right? Like, there's nothing new under the sun, right? So in the 90s, we had otherness, right? Now it's, changed to race, right? They're all just words and we're just, giving them meanings, right? So what are some ways that you see that when, Laura, you're saying in Spain, you're facing this kind of resistance. That kind of resistance still happens here, right? James Sweet, the president of the American Historical whatever association a couple of years ago wrote, this sort of article that says, oh, well, we shouldn't, focus too much on this race stuff lest we become presentists, right? That was the sort of language they used. So what are the ways that we kind of like weaponize older historiography for the people who have been in the academy for 30 years, as you were saying, Laura, and say, hey, actually, 30 years ago, you guys were saying pretty much the same stuff. You just weren't, you're just using a different word for it, right? Because there is nothing new under the sun, right? And even in moments where problematic things were being said in the historiography, that can be like reclaimed in some ways, right? And say, well, let's look at the sort of problematic and reread it through a new lens in order to sort of counter these sort of like stodgy, no, you're being anachronistic people. Thank you all.
Yeah, well, actually, when I started to read about race after I had been like for a year reading about otherness, my first thought was like, they're just using another word, like for a really similar concept. But then I think I found a little bit of a difference, and I think it was really interesting that you mentioned presentism, because it's the first accusation that you hear in Spain towards the American Academy. But I think I mentioned it in my presentation that not presentism, but a link to the present is not that bad. And I think race gives you that in the sense that otherness is the construction of the other. Race is also the same, and it's always done from a place of power. So maybe that wouldn't even be a real difference. But if you say otherness, you're gonna think about the past, and like that was in the early modern, that was in the Middle Ages, that was the Muslims and the Jews in Spain. You're not even thinking about Jews right now, for example. But if you say race, it's like the same methods that were drawn against the Moriscos or the Muslims in Spain. That was what I studied before. It's the same methods that you find nowadays that, for example,
We're losing you, Laura, your connection. Uh-oh, I think we've lost her. Is anybody else having
racist
issues hearing her?
arguments are using, they're really,
Okay.
really similar. So yeah, I understand, like you can say to this, sorry, now maybe?
Yeah, we're losing you a little bit,
Pongo el
but I
internet
think we
remote, ¿no?
understand the gist of it.
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry about that, but I think,
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
there, now we hear you. But I think really at the heart of PCRS and CRT is the social activism, which we saw, you know, in Bisa Butler's work. And so I think that's really something to think about in relationship to this difference between PCRS work and the idea of otherness. There's a lot to it. Anybody else want to respond to Drew? And then we can move on to Elisa.
Yeah, I think I could sort of speak to that, especially when you stated like the weaponizing of older historiography. It's like I'm an art historian, so I deal a lot with that. Essentially like the older works of, well, white men. So beginning my research, I started from an alternate route whereby I looked at primarily CRT scholars and those within feminist theory, Audre Lorde, Bell Hooks, as I've mentioned in my presentation. And these were voices that were long, well, for me, buried, because I didn't come from the Black studies background. So I like interacting with those and like applying their lens onto not only my research, but existing research and scholarship that is well taught traditionally in our historical classrooms was a new thing to do. And I found I got a lot more out of, as you said, weaponizing this new historiography to kind of like put that in a dialectic with this older historiography. So it's not to say that like, I wouldn't say exactly that I weaponize older historiography. I kind of like, I interact with them using what's said in, I can't say, I don't want to call it new because it's not exactly new. These are old or older texts coming from, let's say, the civil rights movements or from eras that were recent, basically to us, but I guess bridging that gap between old. I'm kind of like going back and forth here, but like I hope you get what I'm trying to get at or say. So yeah, like thank you for your question.
Anybody else? We can move on to Elisa's question.
Hi. Yeah, I have two questions. One is for Laura, and I was wondering if you can talk about a little bit about your views on the latest Biennale, the Spanish Pavilion, and the work of Sandra Gamarra on foreigners everywhere. I mean, it was such a beautiful representation of like all the biases of the colonizers and colonized, and it was the first time in 60 years that a Peruvian non-born Spanish took the whole pavilion. So I'm really interested about that. I mean, and see your views on how it was done. And then also to Amber, when I was looking at the cards, which were amazing, I was just thinking immediately, even if they were for King Louis XIV, they look almost like paper dolls. And because if you look at the women, they're all exactly the same, and it looks like they've just been dressed or they've been just painted black. So it's just also, even if they were done for the king, it was almost like an ethnographic parade, of course, and just changing whether if it was the garments or the animals, which are almost like accessories as well. And I'm wondering as well on the figure of Asia, which is just not facing the viewers, the only one that is just like, so any political ideas on that specific card? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question. But sadly, I don't know much about that exhibition. I'm sorry. I mean, I'm not that knowledgeable about contemporary art, and I
We're losing you again, Laura. I'm sorry, but
I
it
can
sounds,
really give an opinion on that. But yeah.
Yes, it
Yeah.
sounds like something that would be very relevant to your work. So I hope you get a chance to learn about
Yeah.
it. Amber,
Yeah,
go
I
ahead.
will check it out. Thank you.
Amber, go ahead.
Hi, yeah, I think the paper dolls idea is really interesting. When I went to the Louvre, I found some of the original sketches, which were like the draft sketches before they went onto the cards. And in these draft sketches, it doesn't label which country is which. It's just a sketch of the women. And some of them, you can see that one image then turns into two completely different countries as the sketch. So it really, like, there was just a few bases. I think there's maybe 9 or 12 original sketches, which then turn into all of the 52 cards. So that idea really, really relates that, like, it's just decorating almost the same woman or coloring that woman black or using accessories or animals, etc. So yeah, I really agree with that. And the ethnographic parade as well. I've been comparing these cards to some of the actual real parades that have happened in Germany and France at the same time, and under the Holy Roman Empire as well, and looking at especially like costume books as well. And so these kind of iconography that we see, which seems to be very much the same with the playing cards to those. Regarding the Asia one, unfortunately, I've just been comparing Europe and Africa and blackness in my chapter, so I haven't been looking at Asia, but I think that's a really interesting question. There's a few other cards which stand out as kind of odd ones out as well. For example, out of all of the ones in Europe, there's only Greece, which is very different, and Greece is actually sat down and is coloured differently and has a very different type of text. And Greece is looking sad, as she's sad because she's just been attacked by the Ottomans, the Turks, and we have the moon in the symbol. So we have a few cards which kind of don't fit the pattern, and so I think some of these are really interesting, could be like for further research, thinking about other things and I, especially if I have time, maybe in a postdoctorate, I would like to turn the cards into a whole project looking at race across the world, but at the moment I'm just specializing in like blackness versus whiteness and Europe versus Africa. But thank you so much for your question.
Wonderful. Yeah, there's so much to do with those cards, Amber. Okay, we have a question in the Q&A for Ronique, and then I have a question for Niyanta, and so we might go over a little bit. I'm sorry about this, but hopefully you'll stick around. So Ronique, this is coming from an anonymous attendee. This is a question for Ronique. Firstly, thank you for such an outstanding presentation. I enjoyed your discussion surrounding Black ontology and its intersection with portraiture and neoclassical bodies. How does Butler diverge from traditional white neoclassical representations of Black bodies? Is there a very specific feature that she places at the forefront? How does this differ from Copley's representations?
Oh, wow.
Yeah, getting to the heart of things there. It's like probably the larger issue of this chapter, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, thank you for your questions. I think Butler really draws on the neoclassical modes of portraiture to kind of visualize the Black body without rooting like the Black ontology within, or the Black ontological position within whiteness. So, and she uses that via like vivid color palette, like I mentioned, where she subverts that like overt attention on skin color. She uses that within the iconographic motifs within the fabric itself. The fabric itself, the vivid African print. So it's like a culmination or amalgamation of different elements that are drawn together, or in her case, sewn together, literally, to create these new identities that also resonate with the old references that she's drawing on. She draws on these old photographs of, well, Black people, and she kind of takes them out of their physical setting and like creates a new way to look at them, like a new lens to view them through. And I think that is really what like catches not only my eye, but like a lot of viewers' eyes in terms of like her work and its relation to, well, neoclassicism. So I hope that answers.
Yeah, I think that's great.
Question.
And we're looking forward to your future study and this really important dissertation. So Niyanta, I just have one more question. I'm so excited that you're working on this and showing the connections between this Dryden's work and imagery that is circulating around the world at this time. And at the end, you started getting to the fact that like Mughal miniatures are being copied into print, and that are you arguing essentially that Dryden would have seen the Mughal miniature via the print medium, or do you think he would have even encountered the actual objects? How far do you want to speculate? Like what I don't know anything about Dryden as an art historian. You know, tell me more about how he would have experienced these images and how they might have inspired his writing.
Thank you so much for that question, Lia, because that is exactly in my also talks with like the other panelists when we met earlier. This was the question. I was like, oh, I really want to think about this. I want to think about the circulation. So that's an ongoing kind of project for me. This is how I'm going to take the project ahead, where I start thinking about the circles of circulation. How exactly are these materials coming from India, traveling from India to the early modern England, and how they are getting used. Now, in the image that I shared from the Poacher's collection, we see that there's an inscription in Persian at the bottom, which is very unusual because the entire text is like, they must have had to like engrave that or something. And using that etching, they've kind of created that kind of like Persian text at the bottom, which identifies the painter as Manohar. So this is one of the Mughal artists, who probably, had painted these portraits, and then they were taken to England with Thomas Rowe. I am not sure how much exposure Dryden would have to these original portraits. I certainly believe that, with the kind of travel literature that is already available and how Burney utilizes a lot of these sources, I feel that Dryden might possibly be using a variety of these sources to understand. And there are translations of Bernier at this point that are available, particularly in English, that I've seen at Folger's collection as well. They have like one of those translations. So I feel that these translations are available. He has that source material for that. In terms of art, he's probably thinking about these kinds of plates, these etchings that are available to us in collections like Purchases. And I'm thinking about how that might lead him to, think about and craft this kind of identity. One thing that's very illuminating about, this kind of representation is how it uses sartorial choices as a mark of gendering. And I think I'm trying to figure it out, but I don't know like how exactly these sources would survive. For instance, what was that plate like that was used for these, these etchings to be kind of reprinted in these collections? Because there are so many different versions of it. I saw 3, and all of them have this particular image that kind of appears in it. So I'm very curious about what that plate would look like. Now, I have no way of knowing that this still exists or if it doesn't exist. So I'm still kind of trying to figure out how I would, focus on these things. There's a lot of evidence of how European art was circulating in the Mughal court, because Mughal artists very enthusiastically embraced certain European motifs and things like that, or stylistic conventions, because they were very intrigued by new forms of, artistic, just, how people draw things or how people portray things. So they routinely use that, but there's not been any study on how this is traveling to England and how English artists are responding to this. So it might be a very marginal thing given the amount of lack of receptivity we see even in writing, the kind of rejection we see of the kind of cultural, production that is happening in India at this point. So I feel that it might not be like a very mainstream kind of, production that we would see, but it definitely is happening in some small, spaces, perhaps that are more interconnected to travel writing and just, travel literature, and how it uses graphical informations as well, like, or just, graphics to actually circulate and present these ideas about a different context. So I'm really interested in that, but I think this is going to be more difficult to conduct as an archival project, like research project, because I have not really heard of any library preserving these plates so far. I don't know. I wish I'm wrong and somebody could tell me, okay, take a look at this, because I would love to do that. But so far, I've not really had any luck, thinking about these.
It just means you're going to have to travel the globe to hunt them down, which is great. But I think you're right that looking at Purchase and other, English illustrated travel narratives is totally the place to go. And so it sounds like you're moving in the right direction, and it'll be really rich work. So thank you all for this incredible panel. You all are brilliant, and this was fascinating.